Welcome back. Thank you, Keith. I understand I have been attempting to confuse you with page numbers, and I am sorry for that. Somewhere along the line when we made a change in our leaders pack from which this came from, the page numbers changed. So if I confuse you on page numbers, raise your hand and say, what page are you on? So I think the page numbers I'm showing on the screen are actually one page ahead of where you are at. So let's see if I can do a better job of keeping us coordinated on that. All right. So I think we are on page 31. Is that right? Very good. All right. So now we're going to talk about the model that you're most familiar with, the administrative board model. This is the model essentially that your bylaws are set up on. And as I indicated, the original purpose was to equip the laity to take care of administrative functions so that the pastor could focus on word and sacrament ministry. And so another purpose was to empower laity for their work as the priesthood of believers for carrying out the Great Commission. In fact, Don Abdens called it organizing around the Great Commission, if you remember that. Laity were often better qualified than the pastor for some of those administrative functions. However, as Abden himself pointed out, lay people serving on boards were to be spiritually qualified. So the congregation, through its governing body, which was the voting body, it governed through the voting body, through the voters. So the Voters' Assembly issued calls to professional church workers. They elected the corporate officers and elected members of the various administrative boards. They also then approved major decisions like budgets and delegating spending authority to the administrative boards, and then would approve major transactions such as purchasing or selling real estate, borrowing money, that kind of thing. The called and employed staff then were required to seek approval for most new ministry initiatives. And often they had to do it at 3 different levels. So if the pastor or the DCE wanted to do something different in ministry, they would go to either the Board of Elders or the youth board, whoever they were accountable to, and present their idea. That board would listen to the idea, discuss it for a while, maybe discuss it for 2 or 3 meetings. Then they'd come up with a resolution which they would present to the parish planning council. Now the planning council was never given authority to make decisions. It was a coordinating council, and so they would talk about it. Maybe they'd send it back to the board for more work. Eventually it would be presented to the Voters' Assembly. And then if somebody had questions at the Voters' Assembly, it might have to go back to the board and go through the process again. What ended up happening is it would take anywhere from 6 months to 1.5 years to get a new ministry initiative approved, because you had all these boards to go through. And the boards didn't meet every day or every week or even every month. And so it took a long time to get things approved. So what ended up happening is very often staff would get discouraged and stop offering suggestions for new ministry initiatives, because even by the time it went through all the approval process, it might look very different in the end, and oftentimes the opportunity was lost. You found that with human care ministries, for example, where you needed to initiate something for some need in the community, and often that would be gone, or for a youth event, or any number of different things. The Parish Planning Council is similar to your, is it council?
Planning Board.
Planning Board, thank you. Would was made up of the officers of the congregation and the chairpeople of the different boards, but they had limited authority on what they could decide without going to the voters. This model, when it first came out, I think worked very well, and that's why it was adopted so broadly across the synod, but it doesn't fit as well today as it once did. And so I'm going to ask you, in your situation, what are some of the problems you see or challenges you see with your current model? Okay, it takes a lot of time to get things through. That's one of the issues. What else?
A lot of people.
It takes a lot of people. Do you ever have difficulties during nominations to fill all the slots?
Yes.
Yeah. Anything else that you see as challenging for this model?
Time commitment sometimes.
Yeah, it requires a lot of time, doesn't it? In fact, for board chairpersons, they have to be at their board meeting, they have to be at every planning council meeting, they have to be at every voters meeting, and then if they have committees, they got to do that. Another one. They lose sight of the mission, yeah. And Linda, did you have something?
I was just agreeing with the time.
Oh, with the time, yeah. Yeah, so here's what we have heard as we've worked with congregations for years in our consulting work. Some of the very same things you've been saying. You can't get enough people to serve because it requires a lot of people for all these different boards. And as a result, even when elected, board members don't always attend the meetings. And then those same board members often don't show up for voters' meetings. Do you have that experience here too? Yeah, it's pretty typical. It's too many meetings. That's part of the issue. And then the meetings are often a waste of time. When I was chairman of our congregation, I'll tell you something that just frustrated me to no end. I would ask for board reports at the voters' meetings, and invariably this would be a sample of a report. Well, we were supposed to meet on the first Tuesday of the month, but we couldn't all get together, so we met on Wednesday instead. And we met over at Martha's house, and if you had her cinnamon rolls, they are so good, you got to have one. And they weren't about any of the church's business. Not only did they lose sight of the big picture, they lost sight of their own board's picture. And there was no preparation, there was no agenda that was sent out in advance, and so people would come and often not know what they were to do, and it just became very frustrating even in receiving reports. But for the staff, it became increasingly frustrating to get approval for new ministry endeavors just because of the time and details. So what's changed? What happened that the system that works so well today is not functioning as well? So we've made an observation about changes in our society, and looking around the room, I think some of you are going to remember some of the things that we're going to talk about. You go back 50 years, and most stores were not open all the evenings of the week. There might have been one evening of the week they were open, and most of them were all closed on Sunday. In fact, I remember if we wanted to go for a Sunday drive, Dad had to fill the car on Saturday because there wasn't even enough gas stations always open. And today, we are a 24/7 society. Now, why does that make a difference to the church? Well, people work at these places, right? And so it used to be that most people that worked from 8 until 4:30 or 9 to 5, something like that. Today, our working people work all hours of the day, literally, 24 hours a day. Why? Because places like Walmart, convenience stores, and everything else, they're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That requires staff that works all these different hours. 50 years ago, the norm was that if you had a family, one family member worked outside of the home and one stayed at home. Today, that's not the case. If you have a family with a father and a mother, often they both work outside the home, and often at different times. Now, it used to be that the schools respected the church's time, and they didn't schedule anything on Sundays. In fact, in our area, there was an evening during the week, on Wednesday evening, when schools had nothing scheduled, because it was considered church night. That's when choir met, it's when confirmation met, there would be children's ministries activities, adult Sunday school, all those kinds of things. That's all gone today. School activities are now also 7 days a week. I was talking to some parents in a city where their son was in hockey. He was in 5th grade. The only time their team could get ice time at 5 o'clock in the morning, Sunday morning. How many of those families do you think went to worship on Sunday morning, let alone board meetings or voters meetings? It just doesn't happen. And then if you've got teenagers, not only do they have all these school activities, but many of them work as well. So if you have a family, it's got 1 or 2 teenagers that's working, and it's a 2-car family, those cars are gone a lot. Even if the parent wanted to come to an evening meeting, they can't because they don't have a car. You see, those things have all changed. And going to a 24/7 society makes it very difficult for people to commit to a monthly meeting. Because they might have to work, or their daughter might be in track, or their son might be in basketball, or they might have a concert or a game they have to go to, or whatever, but they don't have time for meetings. Or they want to do things for the church, but to commit to a monthly meeting is something they're not interested in, especially if nothing meaningful happens. If they're going, and the most important thing they can talk about is Martha's cinnamon rolls, that's a wonderful thing to get together for, but not when you've got a dentist appointment, not when you've got a soccer game you have to be at, not when you have a shift at Walmart. You can't make time for that. And so people don't come to meetings. And they don't volunteer to serve on boards because they don't want to commit to that monthly meeting. And I'll tell you one group that often is very frustrated and why they love our new model, and that's church properties. I find that the people that serve on church properties love to come and do maintenance on the church, but they don't love coming and having a meeting and keeping minutes and doing all of that. They want to come and do something. They don't want to just come and meet. And that's an example of what's happened. And so when you think about it, it makes sense that that model would fit back 50 years ago. But today, it's hard to do it. So the question is, how can we organize in such a way that people can be available for ministry teams for particular projects, but not have to attend all these meetings to get the work done? And is there a way that we can reorganize to help facilitate that? So the other thing that happened is the model itself began to break down. And I don't know what your planning council does, but most parish planning councils became like an executive council, and they started making decisions because it just was too unruly. And most churches started reducing the number of voters' meetings because people weren't showing up anyway, and it was just a waste of time, and the voters weren't making a lot of important decisions, and the parish planning council became de facto a type of governing board, even though it had no authority to do so. So that's what has happened in that particular model, and it can work today, but those are the challenges that that model has. So there's 3 forms of governance that we see forming in our church body, the LCMS today. This would be on page 36, if I'm right. Sue, is that right? Okay, thank you. Looking at her because she's the one that helped me realize that our page numbers are off. So the 3 models are, I was going to talk about, 3 three general models for churches in general, all Christian churches: hierarchical, Presbyterian, and congregational. Hierarchical is a church that's governed by the priests or the clergy. And what's the church body you automatically think of? Catholic Church. Yeah. Catholic Church and the Episcopal Church are primarily a hierarchical church that is governed and managed by the clergy. And if you think about it, this is part of what Luther wanted to get away from. Then there's a Presbyterian model, and I'm not talking about the denomination Presbyterian, but rather a model. And how that model works is it's governed by the elders, and they have two kinds of elders. They have teaching elders and they have ruling elders. Typically, your teaching elders are your preachers, and your ruling elders are often lay people that come alongside them. It's called a presbytery because then churches in a region get together, and all the elders of those churches form a presbytery, and then they make decisions regionally for churches, and then the elders make all the decisions for the churches. Things do not typically go to the congregation for a vote. It's ruled by the elders. Then you have the congregational model, and that's the model that we fall under, where it's governed by the congregation together with the pastors. There's some division of responsibilities there, but you come together to do that. Baptists primarily are congregational models as well. That gives you an example of that. So it's important to make the distinction of those kinds of governance. So now I want to go back to the benefits of policy governance in congregations, and then I want to talk about the limitations of that. First of all, on page 37, you eliminate multiple board meetings, which frees up individuals for service on projects or by appointment. Staff members have freedom to manage their own areas of ministry rather than waiting for boards to meet and make decisions. The senior pastor can depend more on delegating responsibilities to employed staff rather than board volunteers. Regular voters' meetings are reduced to once or twice a year, and the governing board and staff are empowered for designing and implementing the mission. And the temptation for voters to micromanage is minimized because you don't have as many voters' meetings. But the weaknesses are if you use a single governing board, it often fails to separate the spiritual oversight from the financial and social ministry functions. And in the churches we've worked with that have gone to a single board model, that's probably one of the biggest issues we see, is if they eliminate the board of elders, that governing board focuses on financial and property matters, and the spiritual side gets set aside. I'll give you an example. There was a church we worked with that had a policy governance model with one governing board. They called it the board of directors. And the pastor, the senior pastor, thought, well, I need a spiritual board like a board of elders, but the bylaws didn't provide for it. So he appointed a board, which was under his authority to do so. And he appointed a board of men that he then mentored to be spiritual leaders. And they would meet together for study in the Word, and then he would take them on calls, hospital calls, shut-in visits, member visits, and they became a very strong spiritual board. But then the pastor started studying some organizational materials on how to grow an organization. And one of the philosophies he took out of that was comparing the organization to a bus. And it said that you need to get the people on the right seat on the bus. Well, that actually is a good biblical principle, that you need to take people with their gifts and put them in the position that they're gifted and equipped for. But then it said this. It says, the CEO is the driver of this bus. And if people don't like the direction the bus is going, then you tell them to get off the bus. So the pastor adapted this particular philosophy to his leadership style. And when people complained about the direction he was taking the church, he told them to leave. Does anybody have a problem with that? So the elders had a problem with it. The elders said, hey, pastor, we're supposed to go after the lost, not tell people to get lost. But the board of directors was happy because there were more people coming in than were leaving, so the finances were good, see? So the board of directors was happy, but spiritually, the elders were just going, stop. Well, the elders started to press him, so he fired the elders. Now, why could he fire them? Because he appointed them. They were not elected by the congregation. And that's when the church blew up. And you see, that's the difficulty. If you have one board, it's too much to take care of finance, legal, and spiritual. There's too much to do. And our experience is the part that suffers is the spiritual leadership. The other issue is that less people are involved in lay leadership. Now, even if you reduce the number of boards, you already have that. But if you only have one board, you have very limited ability for people to be involved in leadership in the church. And so that becomes a difficulty as well. But then there's one other issue. And that is this. It doesn't fit our teaching and practice of the divine call. So let me tell you what I mean. In many non-Lutheran churches, they have a governing board, but that board hires the pastor and can fire the pastor. In our church, if you had a single board, would it have that authority? No. Who has the authority to call a pastor? Congregation. Who has the authority to rescind the call? Congregation. So now you've got a problem. So let me describe to you how that plays itself out. There was another congregation that was vacant. They were calling a new senior pastor. It was a fairly large church. And the pastor they called said, I won't come unless you adopt policy governance and appoint me as CEO. And they said, okay, we can do that. So he came, they eliminated all their boards, and they had a board of directors. And the pastor was designated as chief executive officer. So they treated it like a corporation, and they gave the pastor full authority to do whatever he wanted to do. As part of their monitoring, and this is how policy governance works, the monitoring says the pastor needs to develop goals for the coming year. So at the end of the first year, they had adopted the model, they put it into place, and pastor came up with his goals for the next year. His goals said, worship attendance will be this number, offerings will be this number, we'll have this many baptisms, we'll have this many confirmations. See, they had to be measurable numbers. So at the end of that second year, he had not met one of his goals. So the board said to him, Pastor, you have not met any of your goals. You need to revise them. He says, fine. So he revised the numbers down, and at the end of the third year, he still had not met any of his goals. So the board says, Pastor, you need to resign. He says, you can't do that because I have a divine call. See, they had no authority to remove him. Now, by this time, they had had multiple boards where a lot of people were in leadership, but for 3 years, they just had this small group of people in leadership. And the only place that people saw their pastor was preaching on Sunday, leading worship. They never saw him making calls because it was a large enough staff. He didn't make calls. He did one Bible class. He did the preaching on Sunday, and he laid out the vision for the church. And so they had a large staff, and the staff was having problems with the pastor. But between the staff and the leadership board, they didn't have enough votes. And so the board said, well, Pastor, then we're going to take this to the congregation. He says, you do that. This is war. That was his quote. And they both went at the congregation, and that church split into two smaller churches. In the end, the pastor resigned and left. All of the leaders resigned and left those churches, and it just destroyed the place. You see, they didn't have the authority to change CEOs, and that's the only way they could govern the church. So in another church where we worked, they had a board of directors, but they also had an elder board. But this church, which was much smaller than South Shore Trinity, their senior pastor had this big vision, and they bought 600 acres. And they were going to develop this real estate into a community from cradle to grave. That was the vision. That's a big vision for a medium small church. And so they bought this, and they appointed the pastor as CEO of the church. So he's now CEO of this major real estate development project. Now, when they started the project, the real estate economy in that area was booming. But you see, this development was just outside of city services. So there was no city water, no city sewer. Well, it turns out that the land that they bought had formerly had some swamp area, and that's where they built their first expensive retirement homes. And so they started building, and the foundation started to settle. So they had to go in and reinforce them, going down deeper. And the roads started to settle, so they had to go and rebuild the roads. But the septic system could not be approved because the water table was too high, and they had to buy this very expensive septic system. Then the economy went bust, and they had all these expensive homes and these high-cost overruns, and now they couldn't sell. Long story short, they went into the hole by several tens of millions of dollars. And when by time we got called in to help, the board of elders and board of directors were at total odds with each other, because the board of directors were happy with the development, even though there were cost overruns and everything else. They were just excited about it. But the elders said, look, pastor isn't spending his time preparing his sermons or preparing Bible study or visiting people. They gave me an example that one week he spent 3 days buying a new tractor for the development. He didn't have time for Word and Sacrament ministry. He was the CEO. And of course, he hired people to manage the construction and manage the marketing, but he had no development experience. How did he know who to hire for those positions? And he hired church members who knew something, but nobody had any skin in the game. They did the whole project on borrowed money. And today, many years later, 20 years later, they're still in a class action lawsuit from all of the investors that lost their money that was lent to that church. The church, of course, lost it. It built a school. It lost the school. It lost the church. The district lost its property. And it still isn't settled. Remember when I asked you if your church owned a restaurant or a hardware store? This is an example where they were getting outside of their mission. The idea of building a Christian community is great. The idea of running a development project is not. It's not the business of the church. And it's not what pastors have been trained to do. And that's the other thing. Some pastors have business experience. I learned that Pastor Bodine, for example, has business experience in the banking industry. But most pastors are not trained in business matters, so they don't know about human resource policy, they don't know about reading financial statements, they don't know about risk management, insurance policies, don't know about legal contracts, they don't know how to manage property. That's not what we've trained them to do. When they go to the seminary, they don't get classes on business administration. That's not what we've trained them to do, and it's not what we've called them to do. And when you appoint a pastor, a CEO, you're telling them to take care of all that kind of stuff. Does that make sense? No. That's not how we want to operate. So those are the difficulties with using that model in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. It might be different if we didn't have our call process come from the congregation, but we do. So you'll see large churches, non-Lutheran churches, adopt this model, and they do fairly well. But if you get into the inside, that governing board can hire and fire the pastor. The congregation doesn't do it. And that's not how we function. So what's the answer? On page 41, I want to propose what we've been recommending to congregations for many years. And for a lot of years, we've proposed this kind of model, but we did not have sample constitution bylaws and policy manuals. And the reason I resisted that is I thought, congregations vary by size, by culture. They may want to make differences. I didn't want a cookie cutter model that everybody used because everybody's a little bit different. But I found that over time, I was very disappointed when congregations tried to adopt this model but didn't have good governing documents. And so we developed the model documents that we're going to be looking at this afternoon. And I want you to know that you can make modifications to those, but they give you a foundation to build from. And what we did was, I put them in a Word document format so that you can customize them and make alterations to it to fit your particular church. But I want to describe the model and how we came up with it. It's either a 2-board or a 3-board model you'll see. The 3-board model is for any church that has a tuition-based education ministry, in your case, a preschool. And the reason we have that 3rd board for that part of the ministry is very often it's a significant part of the church budget and a significant church ministry, and it deserves its own board. But if you look at this organizational chart, you'll see that we still recognize that Christ is the head of the church and that the congregation is the main governing authority. But instead of it being a micromanagement board, it only meets once or twice a year, depending on what you want it to do, and it makes the major decisions. It still calls the pastors and all of our commission workers. If you want, it can still approve the budget on a mega scale. We don't recommend that you take the detailed budget there, but just a 1-page summary of the budget, so that the voters' assembly can be concerned about big picture items. If you're going to sell a piece of real estate or borrow $500,000, that kind of thing, that the congregation should have opportunity to have input. The congregation also elects all the board members, elders, council, and school board. So you'll see that the senior pastor is in 2 places, and that's because he's called by the congregation to serve the congregation according to the responsibilities in the supplement to the Diploma of Vocation. And he is accountable directly to God through the congregation. However, on behalf of the congregation, the Board of Elders work together with the pastor and assist in administrative functions. But unlike a corporate board where the roles are very distinct, they work together here. And you can define how you want to separate those. But we do want to respect that our pastor is the called spiritual leader of our church, and he's been trained for that. But the elders play an important role in the spiritual matters as well. What if the pastor goes off the rails in his theology? Now, I know that Pastor Bob would never do that, unless he gets a little bit sick or something. But still, somebody in the congregation has to be accountable for that, see? And this is why it's so important that the elders be spiritual people, because they need to be able to recognize if there's false teaching in their church. Because ultimately, it's the congregation's responsibility to monitor that. And it's rare, but it does happen, that sometimes a pastor starts teaching false teaching. And the elders need to hold accountable to that. But they're also there to be partners with the pastor, to assist with calls, to assist with spiritual matters, relationship issues, those kinds of things. So the Board of Elders is a spiritual board, not a corporate board. Then the church council is more of a corporate type board. But what it does is it's responsible for the legal and financial matters of the congregation. So it looks at finances, and it has a staff person accountable to it called the church administrator. Could be a business manager, could be any title you want to have. And for a church your size, it may not be a full-time position, it might be just part-time, it might be even a volunteer position. And people say, well, can you really get somebody qualified to do that work? I'll tell you what I find. I find that, especially in churches the size of South Shore Trinity, that you have very gifted people from all different vocations, including business. And oftentimes you take a retired business person, man or woman, who's experienced in these areas, and they want to give back to the church. And very often they are willing to work on a part-time basis just to assist the church. They're retired anyway. And they can do a very good job for that. And that's what I find that churches your size will often do. As the church grows, you might be able to justify a full-time position. Our church right now has a full-time director of operations, for example. And then they work like a governing board. So they set policy in their area of responsibility. They don't make the council doesn't make the daily decisions, so they don't decide whether or not we're going to have somebody come and do maintenance on the heating system or the cooling system. They don't make a decision on whether we're going to lease a new printer copier or whether we're going to purchase one. The administrator makes that decision. But they set general policies that guide what he can do or not do in those kinds of areas. They also do not develop employee manuals. The administrator does that. That's his area of responsibility. So that would be an example there. Then the school board. School board is kind of a combination of the two boards. It's somewhat spiritual nature, but somewhat administrative in nature. And they have one staff person accountable to them. In your case, it would be the preschool director. But the preschool director is an administrative function in which he or she is responsible for putting together his or her own budget, for hiring other teachers or aides. The administrator does that, not the board, but the board guides it. And this is what I say to education boards. If you want to run this school, if you want to make all of those decisions for the school, then fire your director, come in here every day and manage it. If you don't want to manage it, set governing policies that guide a good administrator to administrate it. So if you want an administrator, get one that's qualified and let them do their job. If not, come in here every day and do it for them. That's what I say to school boards. So they don't make decisions on things like dress code or on student handbooks, all of those kinds of things. Those are administrative functions, but they set policy. So for example, for a school, what I tell the school board, you don't tell the administrator what curricula to buy, but you do say our curricula must meet these limitations. So for example, curricula limitation, whatever you buy must be consistent with our confession of faith as stated in our Constitution. Your Constitution has a confession of faith, subscribing to the Lutheran confessions and the scriptures. And anything that goes on in your education programs should be consistent with that. And so the school board makes a policy saying all curricula must be in concurrence with that, or you must have a plan to make the distinction as you're teaching that curricula. So those would be examples of what the school board does. Any questions on that particular model?
Is there with this
checks and balances, you know, which have gotten some churches into trouble where, you know, some of the things you described as situational, you know, where there wasn't a number of people at least checking to make sure that finances were spent properly and not being pilfered from the congregation? Or is there enough checks and balances in this?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question, and that's why we suggest a three-board model. So let me describe how that works. Because one of the criticisms of this model is, well, if you have three different leadership boards, won't they ever disagree with one another where there's overlap? My answer is, I hope so. Why? For the very thing that you're saying. I want you to think of a large organization that has three branches in its government. Okay? Now, do those three branches ever disagree? It's not the most efficient form of governance. What is the most efficient form of governance? A dictatorship. How many Americans would like to give up our inefficient model to have a dictator like in Syria? No way. Why? It's because of Genesis 3. What happened in Genesis 3? Sin. That's exactly right. You see, it's very efficient to have a monarchy or a dictatorship or an emperorship because you've got one person making all the decisions. The problem is there's no checks and balances. And so the nice thing about the administrative board model, you had lots of them, but the problem is it's almost too much. This narrows it to where you've got it down to three boards. Now, each of those three boards have their areas of responsibility. But here's, for example, you asked about finance. The difference is, if the church council believes that the administrator is not managing finances properly, what can they do? Fire him and get a new one. Change him, that's right. They change administrators. So that is not a called position. And the other thing that we recommend in our policies is that the church council has the authority to determine who to hire for that position, but they must do it with the concurrence or agreement of the pastor. So the pastor can't decide who to hire, but they have to have his agreement to hire that person. Why is that in there? Absolutely. That pastor has to work with that church administrator, and what else? Yes. He needs to qualify that person spiritually, because South Shore Trinity is not just a business. It is first and foremost the church of God. It is a ministry. And you want somebody spiritually mature in that position, because if you get somebody that's spiritually immature, well, let me give you an example. We were called to work with the church in conflict. The head elder, chairman of the congregation, vice chairman of the congregation were in loggerheads with the senior elder. They were in major disagreement. And we went and made a proposal to help them to reconcile and to work through their material issues. But this is what the head elder said. By the way, the head elder owned the largest farm implement dealership in the county. Okay? He said, look, my employees know who signs their check. And he says, I'm head elder here, and pastor better know who signs his check or he's out of here. Now, this head elder and the chairman of the congregation and vice chairman of the congregation never attended Bible study. And in fact, what the head elder would do is he would stand in the narthex as people were coming in, and he'd pull people aside to complain about the pastor, and whoever he was talking to, they wouldn't come in until the middle of the sermon. They wouldn't come into worship. He was keeping people out of worship so he could complain about the pastor. Yeah.
I love your book, and it's almost like back to the fundamentals in a way. It's almost like if it was academic, it would be, here's the fundamentals of this. If it was sports, it would be like we're getting back to the fundamentals. So now what I say when
Genesis 3. And so let me give you some examples of very godly people that went off the rails. King David. Here's a man who wrote many of the Psalms that we're still singing today. He was a shepherd boy from a very low position. God appointed him to a very high position. He was a very godly man. More is written about this man than any other man in the Bible, except for Christ. And what happens? He gets very wealthy, and he has an affair with a married woman. When she becomes pregnant, instead of confessing, he tries to cover it up, arranges to have her husband killed in battle, and then marries her like nothing happened. It happens. And what happened in David's case is power and authority got in the way, and these things can affect all of us. Now, the good news for David and the hope we have is God still loved David. Now, see, if I was God, I would have zapped him. Zap! I did all this for you, and this is how you treat me. But no, God sent him a Nathan to confront him, and David confessed his sin, and God forgave him. And then it was through David and Bathsheba that the Messiah came from. So, there's great hope in how we as sinful people react. But the key is that if we're not staying in the Word, we're more likely to get off the rails. So, yeah, over here.
My question is on that elder that stood out from the hallway. Did the other elders know about it and they didn't hold him accountable?
No,
Were the whole people accountable?
that's right. Because their leaders weren't in the Word, many of them weren't either, and they didn't know what to do. And of course, he was a very powerful, very influential man in that community, but they were not holding him accountable. And so it deteriorated. And that's what can happen. And it can happen to any of us. If it can happen to David, we're all susceptible. And that's why we need to be there for one another. It's what the body of Christ is for. To encourage, to remind, to teach, to exhort, to admonish, and always come back to the foot of the cross where the gospel is. Yes?
One of the things that Keith mentioned in your model here, we have the church administrator who is responsible for finance and everything else. When you develop the model, when you develop this process, you set it up to where you have outside monitoring of the finances on a yearly basis or whatever, so you don't have those issues that happened in previous churches.
So what the church needs to do is conduct annual or at least every other year audits. And you can, if you've got qualified people from within, you can do that, but you can also use an accounting firm to do that. What happens is, because of Genesis 3, it's just another way of holding people accountable. But I've been in churches. I told you in our own church we had an embezzlement problem where we weren't doing audits of some of those areas that were under that individual's area. We just need that in place. The other thing audits do, by the way, is they protect those that are doing the work from false accusation. So it's not just trying to catch people, it's also trying to affirm people of what we're doing and being accountable for it. Yeah. Other questions? Yes?
Has the synod, the main synod, ever checked on congregations to see how many of their elders are in Bible study? Is that a statistic on that?
To my knowledge, they don't have a statistic on that. In fact, what's interesting to me is they have lots of statistics on membership, baptisms, confirmations, deaths, transfers, but they don't maintain records on Bible study attendance and or leaders in Bible study. They don't track that at all. Speaking of synod, however, yes, go ahead.
Going with what Mary said, I wondered about this too. I love your model and I love everything how this fits in. Doing, and you might have done this before I got here, so if you correct me, but so you take the Missouri.
That's what people at home.
Okay, so you take the Missouri Synod as an example. When we went through the COVID thing, we got a letter from the synod from, I forget what the gentleman's name was, and I didn't like the letter because it really didn't say yes or no or whatever. You didn't know what to do, and it's like, why did this guy write this letter? President Harrison, nothing against President Harrison, I'm sure he's a great, wonderful man, but it's like, why did this guy write this letter? I'm more confused than when I was here. You usher in the back of church, you still have ladies coming up to you, well, do you want me to wear my mask or not? You're like, I don't know. And then Sally sends out a letter, and they still come up, and everybody doesn't know. My point is, President Harrison, I haven't met him, I'm sure he's a wonderful man. How much more should we look for our synod for leadership to put into the model that you have here? Because the model's great, everything's great, but then I'm like, okay, am I expecting too much from the synod? You know what I mean on these matters.
So it's a great question, and let me tell you, part of my background, I spent 7 years on Synod's board of directors. So I learned a lot about how Synod is organized and how it functions. And here's what I learned. The congregation, and this is in Synod's constitution, the congregation is autonomous relative to the Synod. We're not a hierarchical situation like the Catholic Church is, where they can dictate from above. Our Synod president has no such authority. It's the congregations that are the head of Synod. And so when we meet together in convention, our 6,100 congregations are represented by the delegates we elect in our circuits. We're the head of the synod.
Okay, so I'm looking for leadership that's not in here.
So there's leadership. Yeah. So there is leadership, but it's of persuasion, not of telling you what to do. And so, and I'll tell you the reason why President Harrison didn't give specific direction. Not only does he not have authority to dictate it, but every church was in a different situation. And some needed to be far more cautious than others. And so if he was to dictate what 6,100 congregations would do, he would have a riot on his hands. So.
So what's the point of his letter then? What's the point of his letter?
It was intended to be encouraging and encouraging to do what's right for your community. Yeah, and then every state, and of course, and we're still not done with this, of course, you know.
That's just an example. But that's just an example of leadership. When does this guy step in? When does he do? You know, what should we expect from these guys? And you've answered it. So my expectations are way too high from these guys. So I appreciate that.
I'll tell you where his authority does lie, though, and this extends through the district presidents. He has spiritual authority, much like our pastors do. And so his ecclesiastical authority is that if there, for example, is a pastor in our synod that is teaching false doctrine, through the district presidents, they can remove that person from the roster of synod, meaning can defrock him. And so we have a whole system for that, and that's part of his extended authority. So that would be an example of that. When I was on Synod's board of directors, that's where I got a preview of this model, really, because our synod is organized in this way. So the synodical president is elected by the synod and convention. He is the spiritual leader, but the board of directors is responsible for the legal and financial aspects. Now, the president of the synod is on the board of directors, and we hired a chief administrative officer to do all the operations of synod. Now, at the time that I was on the board, our budget was $100 million a year, but we oversaw 50 corporations of synod, and we had over $2 billion in assets. Our board didn't have the time to go and manage all those 50 corporations or manage all those assets. We had staff people in place to do that, but we did that through our chief administrative officer. The president had to approve the chief administrative officer, but he couldn't decide who to hire, and our board could remove that person at any time. So it worked very much like the model of what I'm describing here, and it's consistent with our practice and teaching on the divine call. So, yes?
I'm awestruck by your spiritual, because I listened to his message, on his station when this epidemic started. He gave a profound, thought-provoking, spiritual message to all who wanted to listen. And very little conversation is done about that. During it, he also was, the pandemic, he's been on to give messages to all of us as even congregational members. And these are the items that we don't discuss even in our Bible studies or even among ourselves. And at the same time, that headquarters down there, 5 days a week at 10 o'clock, runs a chapel service. If 8,800 pastors listened to that, not to mention any of our members, we would have an earthquake.
Yeah, I've been in many of those chapel services because I've been to the International Center many times. But yeah, our synod is formed the way it is partially because of the Reformation and some other things that happened when Lutherans moved to this country. And there's a lot of things that are not perfect about our system, I can tell you that. I experienced a lot of those things. But I've not yet found another church body that I'm willing to move to. So, anyway. Well, I'm going to briefly talk about where other boards serve. This would be on page 45 and 46. People say, well, what happens to these other boards? Well, the boards aren't elected anymore, but some of the work that they do still needs to be done. And the example I gave earlier is one that people really like, and that's church properties, or sometimes they're called trustees. I find that they really are not crazy about meeting monthly and keeping minutes and doing all that thing. They want to just come and work on projects. And that's what many people today want to do. So there was this one church that had a board of trustees. They went to this model, and so the board of trustees didn't have to meet anymore monthly. They loved it. But they called them the Nehemiah Boys. That was their name, and they would come every Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, and they would gather for a Bible study. They'd meet in Bible study for an hour, and then the church administrator gave them a list of things to do, and they'd go whistling throughout the church, doing their repairs and their maintenance items and everything else, and everybody loved the Nehemiah Boys because it was always a positive thing that happened. And that's just an example of what happens. So what these other boards do is they become ministry teams that can work either long-term or short-term. And you already have some ministry teams. So for example, Sunday school operates as a ministry team. You don't elect Sunday school teachers, right? They're appointed, and they do their job regularly. You don't elect choir members, but people come together as a choir and sing. Those are examples of ministry teams that are ongoing, but special projects. So you have a time in the fall and a time in the spring where you do major church cleanup. You ask people to come. Somebody needs to organize that. In this case, the church administrator. Or if he wants to appoint a couple people to do the organization, he can do that. But he appoints people through the staff rather than through a board. And when you have people working on staff doing this, they know what needs to be done, and they can help organize that. So all these other positions, so what happens under the senior pastor is anything that's spiritual minded. His own administrative assistant, of course, parish education, youth, stewardship, evangelism. Under the administrator, what would be the church properties or trustee, fellowship, public relations, stewardship, financial secretary, bookkeeper, all of that would come under the administrator. Under the principal or director of the school, if they have staff, they hire their own staff, supervise them, and work with the parents. And so that's just a brief description where they all go. They all end up working as ministry teams instead of boards. So with that, yeah, I'm trying to point to it. That's a good question. So ministry teams are easier to fill because it's not a 2-year commitment. It's not a monthly meeting. And you let people know where you need help. How do you feel your Sunday school teachers? Ask them. Yeah. You know, how do you get people to sing for choir? You ask them. How do you get people together to do a cleaning project at church? Same way. But you don't have to go through a nomination process, an election process. They don't have to have monthly meetings. They don't have to keep minutes. They just come and do the project, and they're done. Sometimes it's easier to conceive it as, do you ever do mission teams? Send out mission teams? Same thing there. That's not an elected position. It's something that you work with people, you let them know what the opportunity is, they come and they serve and they do it. Servant events would be another one. I would imagine a lot of your youth events are that way. So that's what you do. Now here are some of the concerns raised. Is there going to be some role confusion and overlapping responsibilities? There might be some. Less efficiency, yes, because you got checks and balances. More difficult to determine the success of the whole operation because you don't have one person in charge, yeah. And the senior pastor has less control over administration areas. All of those concerns are true, but here are the advantages. The pastor's work is primarily spiritual. You have lay spiritual leaders in the Board of Elders. Administration is assigned to people who are skilled and trained in those areas. It avoids the temptation of evaluating the pastor based solely on easily measured goals. The school gets more consideration with its own board, and the school can help meet certification requirements because you've got an administrator that's taking care of it. So it's time for lunch. So think about the questions that you have. Of course, I'll be around during lunch. Come and talk with me, and we'll talk more when we come back. We'll take about 45 minutes for lunch. When we come back, of course, we're going to be singing a hymn, preview. The hymn is I Love Your Kingdom, Lord. So that's what we'll be singing when we come back. So do you have directions? Or?
Quick announcements.
Okay.
Okay, so everything's going to be downstairs in the fellowship hall, and we have Subway sandwiches, so they, I think, are putting them into the different platters based on, you know, whether it's tuna or turkey or whatever the case may be. So help yourselves to that. There's also different varieties of chips and pop and water and all that kind of good stuff. So feel free to go downstairs, obviously, sit wherever you feel like, and then come on up whenever, but
12:30.
at 12:30. Should I say a prayer, or do you want to?
I was going to ask if one of our lay leaders would like to lead.
Wonderful idea. I love that idea. Lay person. Where's the mic? Up there.
Okay. Not that I recall. Because, oh, I should.
Mary's going to lead us.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you that we could come all together to listen to the proposals and to learn about ideas for our congregation. We ask you to bless this food that we are about to partake in and continue to bless this congregation. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.